what that leads to is that they focus on only the stuff that can help them. And that's really a huge problem. And it's one I see running through this case. They decided, you decide what happened or who the bad guy is, and then everything gets filtered through that. And where I want to say it from a personal experience and how this can play out is, and I feel, I wouldn't go so far as say affinity for Kevin Urich, but I have a sense of where he's coming from. And the reason I do is before I was out here in Minnesota, I worked for the Attorney General's office in California. I was in the Correctional Law Division. Section. So what that meant is I was defending the state and individuals employed by the state from lawsuits brought by inmates. So that could go for class actions. That could be pro se cases where they're complaining about something relatively small, like a correctional officer broke their rap CD or something a little bit more, like they were placed in ADSEG, lockdown when they shouldn't have been. They didn't get due process. And and I've talked about this a bit, but this is an anecdote that I don't think I have. In a lot of these cases, big law firms would get involved and have some of their partner, a senior associate, and some younger associates who would get involved with the case and would work up the case for trial if it was getting to that point. And so in this case, I was on it, and the issue was whether an inmate had received proper process before he had been validated as a prison gang associate, which was a big deal because prison gangs are a big deal in California. And if you're validated as a prison gang associate and you have an indeterminate life sentence, like 15 years to life, you're pretty much not going to parole. You're going to be in a lockdown unit in what's called a security housing unit at Pelican Bay is the main one. And until you debrief, which is tell the secrets of the gang or a few other ways, you're not getting out. So I look back on me in that case, representing the state and representing people employed by the state, and there were a lot of problems that happened in this case. There was testimony that some correctional officers and sergeants made that turned out to they contradicted themselves. There was a report relied on that even after the contents of it turned out not to be true, it was still, the substance of the report turned out not to be true. It was still relied on for other purposes. And all this is to say that to this day, when I think about the case, I think, well, maybe things didn't go the way they should have been. Maybe the guy didn't get proper process, but he was basically where he ended up kind of where he should have. And so what I mean is I have conflicted feelings. On one hand, I don't think the way the process went was right. And I definitely am not a fan of having people locked up, forever basically, because they're validated with the prison gang. Something has to change. This crazy overcrowding is a huge problem. But when I think about the case and what I know about it, I still think of the negatives for the plaintiff, the guy on the other side. And so where I'm going with this is I'm hearing Urich talk about it, and he's saying, he's sort of echoing the way I felt at the time. Look, there's these problems. I would say there's these problems with correctional officers and cops. They are not accountants. They don't think like mathematicians. They're used to not being challenged, and they're used to being very big, broad statements, and they do very poorly at trial and in depositions and when cross-examined. So it's going to be expected that they're going to contradict themselves. But is the stem of the story true? Was the inmate, the things that were found in the cell, did he have them? Did he have those razor blades that were found in the cell? Were they planted? Are you a conspiracy theorist? And that's the sort of interaction I had with the other side and what happened in the case. So what I'm saying is I see where I don't agree with him, but I see where he's coming from, where he's saying, look, there's all these problems that we have in cases like this, and the what they're pointing out, we just have to kind of live with. Okay, so that's just, I'm not sure where I was going with that, but anyway, it seemed important to me when I was writing it down. But why is that such a problem in this case? Well, I want to give an example, an anecdote from my own life that shows this misunderstanding that Kevin Urich has with collateral and material information. And one of the last times I talked, last time or the time before, I talked about a time of being unfairly accused of something very silly, of stealing gum. This is back when I was 7 or 8. And I thought, as I was sitting there, I thought, well, what if, that someone had it in for me, and they decided they were going to get me for stealing gum, even though I didn't steal gum. And they had a star witness, this guy who said, hey, you stole gum, and kept saying it. And let's assume that every time they talked to him, the story changed. It was a different time, it was a different place, it was a different way I stole gum. The conversations I had with him were different, and we get to some sort of trial, and the prosecutor said, well, none of that stuff matters. What matters is that this guy said he saw Brendan steal gum. And that's all that matters. And we know from some records, from eyewitness testimony, maybe even surveillance records, that at some point that day, they were together. They were in the same store at the same place. And unless there's something that shows they weren't together, we have enough for our case. And that's how I feel like everything, it's gone down in this case. And that's what struck me from this episode and from the interview with Kevin Urich. And I think that's really how, as this case progressed and they saw all these problems, how they dealt with it. I want to talk about experts. I tweeted today, I looked up the expert that was the prosecution's cell phone expert in Adnan Syed case, because one of the things that Bob pointed out in Serial Dynasty is that the way things went with this expert is different than most expert witnesses behave, for, in my experience, a very simple reason. If you're an expert witness and you do things that are consistently sort of shoddy, biased, and you lose credibility, no one wants to hire you. You have to at least have the illusion of objectivity. And there's all sorts of things that people do as experts to sort of show that they're not biased. They'll be very careful about how they do reports. They'll try to seem at least like they work equally for both sides, which many times they don't. But the lengths they go to show that are remarkable, and I've talked about that before, where they will, there's so many things that they'll do. I won't even get into that now. But this guy, you don't see any of that. And I looked him up on Westlaw and some other places, and as far as I can tell, he had never testified in any other case. And I said, that explains a lot. Well, what it explains is that he behaved a lot differently than expert witnesses usually do, because he's not really an expert witness. He's not a testifying expert witness. And it also jogged a feeling from the past, because when you're representing the state, you have a lot of advantages that I didn't consider at the time. And one is that the people who are in the know about a lot are either directly or indirectly aligned with your side. So, for instance, in this case,